This model, if you build it, they will come, would have the government or sanctioned scholars develop national standards, tests, and accountability metrics. States, however, would not be forced to accept or comply with these standards, but the government might provide incentives such as tax breaks or increased funding for those who do accept them. The model has the potential to end the race to the bottom, but as states are not forced to comply, they may choose through local pressure to stick with their own easier standards in place of more rigorous national ones. This inconsistency for student performance creates an inconsistency in teaching and what students learn. State policymakers, however, could use the idea of the possible incentives as a good reason to adopt the national standards. So the race to the bottom can end with the implementation of this model, but it is not guaranteed.
My question was, is it likely to result in rigorous standards? And the answer is yes. Diane Ravitch stated that the hardest thing to do was to persuade anyone to leave something out of the standards. So basically, whenever they're trying to form these standards, they're trying to make everybody happy. And by the time they add in all the aspects that will make every state happy, the document is actually unteachable because there's so much information. It's hoped that this process will have politically correct motives, and the people who actually have motives that are questionable will be confronted head-on by the people who are actually designing the standards. The beauty of this approach is that all standards and tests will be made available to the states to review before they actually have to implement them. And if the states do not like the proposal, they don't have to put it into action. All the decisions are voluntary, and in this scenario, states who do not agree with a specific standard or who have a problem implementing the standards are able to simply ignore them and just quit at any time. There are also a few states that have rather higher standards, so they'll be able to determine whether the national standards are better than their state standards or whether they're happy with the standards that they already have. And the reason that this standard would actually be approved is because they would offer funding to the states, and the higher your NAEP performance scores would be, the more state funding and federal funding you would get for these programs. So basically they're trying to bribe the states into implementing these national standards.
So is this model likely to lead to an expanded federal role in education? And it might. Andrew Rotherham believes that the federal government is usually the one to prod the states to better serve the underserved populations such as minority children. And he thinks that if the federal government had a bigger role in education, then it wouldn't be such a bad thing in that case. And others think that they could just be drawn deeper into operating schools, and it might not be a good thing, and that they could just issue ineffectual, burdensome edicts, as James Pizer believes. So it could go either way, good or bad.
Is it likely to prove politically feasible? The answer to that question is maybe. Making changes to anything requires a sacrifice. One sacrifice would be leveling the testing market, and by having a national standard. Money-motivated companies would be against it, but those companies that are for the education would not mind the national standard. Politically, opponents would fear that the other would try to take over the national standards, but again, this is politics, and one group will always point the finger at the other group. The answer to this, the answer is to build a national entity with real integrity. According to Diane Ravitch, this is not an easy task, but it can be done. The longer we wait, the worse off we'll be in our educational system.
We had model number 3, which is let's all hold hands. And under this approach, states would be encouraged to join together to develop common standards and tests, or at least common test items. Uncle Sam might provide incentives for such collaboration, but that's it. And I have the question of, will it or is it likely to end the race to the bottom? And the answer to that question is possibly. A problem might be what's known as the lowest common denominator standards. and any collaborative efforts risk this effect because the states will want to stick with their already low standards and easy tests. But on a positive side, with state policymakers working together, it could keep them from adopting low-level standards.
The question I had was, would holding hands expand the role of the federal government? And the answer to this question is no. Since America's history, education has been brought on by states. Each state has made their own curriculums. Increasing the role of the federal government would not help because eventually the decisions will fall into individual state governments. The only way I can see federal government helping is playing the role of incentives of financing, giving financial help. But the problem in this is that usually the people with the money make the rules, and it would be hard to imagine the federal government providing finances for education and not stapling their own type of curriculum. The second question I had was, would it result in rigorous standards? And I think the question to this answer is no. There was an interesting quote in the reading that said, any collaborative effort risks a quiet push towards the lowest common denominator of standards. And I think this is accurate because if all states worked on the same curriculum, we would eventually be going to the lowest state standards, like they said, the lowest common denominator, so each state could pass, pulling each other up. I also don't think it would result in rigorous standards because teachers in America are judged on test scores, and raising tests and making tests harder on students would result in firing of teachers and a messy situation in America. One positive thing about this is that it would require no congressional action, and each state would be able to make their own curriculums. And the last thing about this is that tests would probably start off low and maybe get more rigorous as time went on, possibly.
My question was, is it likely to prove politically feasible? And my answer is maybe. One of the most promising aspects is that it requires no congressional action unless the federal people want to provide incentives for the states to work together. In fact, there are already some current efforts that show that this is happening. The American Diploma Project is a multi-state collaborative, and that's the governors working on a common high school graduation requirements. This model would also avoid the opposition of testing companies, those who make the tests, because it would not require a single national test. So the states would provide companies who make their own test. Because the model would not allow a single national test, it would avoid the opposition of testing companies that are making a lot of money off of the current system.